Economic inequality has become a central issue in our current political discourse, as nations around the world face a reckoning on race and social justice and work to contain the economic damage from the pandemic.
We have a choice in this country, and that choice is either great wealth in the hands of a few or a democracy.
Is it time to redistribute the wealth?
Pointing to billionaires and saying we should take their money away may feel good, but it's an ineffective political strategy.
Two perspectives.
How else are you going to take a lot of wealth from rich people and give it to poor people if it's not through taxation?
On a cornerstone of our economic future.
It's not a debate about the wealth tax. I'm far more concerned about corporate wealth, the accumulation of gargantuan power.
Join us for That's Debatable, presented by Bloomberg and Intelligence Squared. From Washington, D.C., I'm John Donvan, your host and moderator, and welcome to That's Debatable, an interactive series on today's most pressing issues. The resolution: it's time to redistribute the wealth. 44% of the world's wealth is owned by the richest 1% alone. Is that a trend that merits disruption? We presented that question to our two teams of two. Against the motion, Larry Summers, former U.S. Treasury Secretary, and Allison Schrager, senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Arguing for the motion, Yanis Varoufakis, former finance minister of Greece, and Robert Reich, former U.S. Secretary of Labor. Let's go to their opening statements.
What we need to understand is that, and many of you already know this country cannot afford to do many of the things it needs to do. Our infrastructure is crumbling. It is falling apart. Many of our schools, our public schools in working class and poor areas, are overcrowded. The classrooms have 30 to 40 kids. Teachers are underpaid. The facilities are bad. We also know that there is a dearth of basic research and development in this country. People are concerned about American competitiveness, but we are not doing much about it in terms of basic R&D. And healthcare. We know there are huge numbers of people who are not able to afford health insurance, millions of Americans. During this period of coronavirus, it is all worse because we have something in the order of 35 million Americans who are out of work. Many of them are trying to decide between paying the rent and putting food on the table. We have an extraordinary number of children who are at this moment either homeless or hungry or both. Now, where is that money going to come from? It turns out that the typical American pays about 25 to 30% of his or her income in taxes right now. If you include sales taxes and property taxes, every tax, about 25 to 30%. But if you're a billionaire today, you're actually paying 23% on average. In other words, the richer you are, if you're very much at the very, very top, you are paying a lower tax rate. That's not only unfair, but at a time when so many people are so desperate and so many people are struggling so hard, it is unwarranted. It's bad policy. Now, let me just add one other very important fact here, and just quote Justice Brandeis to say, we have a choice in this country, and that choice is either great wealth in the hands of a few or a democracy. We can't have both because money at the top turns into political power.
These are really sort of wild estimates, often based on some very dubious assumptions. In fact, the numbers you just heard cited by our opponent might be off more than a factor of 4. And the reason why we know so little is most of the richest Americans made their money starting their own companies, which they held closely and managed as they grew rich. If you look at the Forbes 400 richest Americans, 8 of the 10 top richest Americans all got rich starting their own companies. And 2/3 of the full 400 are self-made entrepreneurs. And unlike stock or a publicly held company, it's not only hard to put a value on a privately held company, it's also really hard to sell. And most rich people are much richer on paper and don't have a lot of liquid wealth to pay the tax, which means paying it will force them to sell their companies sooner, usually to private equity funds who will have a say in management and be a lot more short-term focused. Now, other countries have grappled with this when they had wealth taxes, and the way around it was maybe limiting the wealth tax based on how much income or financial assets they had, but this just created tons of loopholes which allowed them to get around paying the tax. In fact, lack of compliance is why so few countries tax wealth. In 1990, 12 European countries tax wealth, not only 4 do, and the tax rates are very low and make up a really trivial amount of their total tax revenue. Switzerland probably collects the most in wealth taxes, and it's only 3% of their total tax revenue. A wealth tax also, because it's so hard to value, creates an incentive to keep a company private for longer and not do that IPO. That could mean possibly the next Amazon won't be sold in public markets, which in some ways worsens inequality, because it means the average American doesn't have access to own our best fast-growing companies. So even if you think we should need to tax rich people more, or even if you don't and you just think we need more revenue to pay for all of the services we want or just pay off our debts, and you think it's better to tax rich people than lower income people, redistributing wealth or a wealth tax is a terrible way to do it.
The wealth tax is just one way and not the most efficient way. I would agree with you. Look, you were referring to wealth creation as if we live in a front porch community where wealth is distributed in proportion to the entrepreneurship of the neighborhood baker, butcher and brewer. That's not the world we live in. Take Jeff Bezos. You mentioned Amazon. He's a smart man, he innovated, he got a lot of money. Good on him. But which part of his 200 billion is due to his entrepreneurship? And which part of it is due to the simple fact that his wealth breeds more wealth? Because, as we know, the ultra-wealthy grow rich in their sleep, as it were. It's got nothing to do with hard work, with risk-taking or economizing, while millions, billions, are not so much left behind, but they are held behind because the wealth concentration and the power of big business, they conspire to cause stagnation for the majority. Uber market power enables corporations to usurp markets, to buy justice, to capture regulators, to pad political campaigns, in short, to poison our liberal democracies. In 1901, Theodore Roosevelt famously broke up Standard Oil, against the background of a huge cacophony of those screaming blue murder about the attack on innovation and entrepreneurship and so on. However, those democratic acts of redistributing power and wealth together eventually ushered in capitalism's finest hour. Now, sadly, since the end of Bretton Woods, we have allowed cartels to dominate again. We face a stark option. Let the ultra-rich continue to snuff out society's potential by constantly redistributing wealth from the producers to themselves, or alter the direction of distribution from the ultra-rich to society's innovators and maintainers. The added bonus being a chance for democracy to breathe again. As for how to do this, there are many different tools. The wealth tax is just one.
We're debating whether an approach based on a politics of envy that starts by putting the central problem as being tearing down the people who are most successful is the right approach to that problem. Or instead, a politics of inclusion, building up, bubbling up to support prosperity is the right way forward. That's the approach that I favor, and it's the reason why I oppose this resolution. The wealth tax. These kinds of approaches are symbolic. They're not effective. There's a practical tax reform agenda. It raises the capital gains tax rate. It ensures that everybody complies with the income tax. It eliminates a range of tax shelters. It can raise $4 trillion, far more than any reasonable estimate that any reputable economist supports for the wealth tax, and can do it without arguing that there are people who need to be torn down. Now, look, I'm worried about political money. We should repeal Citizens United. We should change the laws that allow all kinds of giving to PACs, especially in non-transparent ways. Here's what will happen if you actually try to say that people's wealth has to go away. They'll give their money to so-called charities. Those charities will intervene in all the political process that way. And if you don't like the Koch brothers and what they do to American politics right now, you will have far more of it if you tell them that they can't keep their wealth and they can give it to whatever they want, and they'll give it to something that will do much more to subvert the process. So the most important thing that I've learned is that it's not enough to care. You have to count carefully and rigorously if you want to make the world a better place. And framing the problem in terms of tearing down the most successful people isn't the way to fix those schools. It isn't the way to clean the air. It isn't the way to repair a decaying infrastructure. Building from the middle class without a politics of envy is the way.
This is not about the politics of envy. This is about a concern about the relationship between wealth and power. Wealth translates into power. Larry Summers and I have both served in the government. Both of us know what that means.
And now we move on to round two, and that's where the debaters take questions from me and also from you in our audience. The resolution is this: it is time to redistribute the wealth. And I want to go back to Robert Reich to start with my first question. Is your argument that imbalance in and of itself is the thing that's destructive to democracy, or is it the particular kind of imbalance we have now?
Well, let me make the argument very, very clear, John. This is not about the politics of envy. This is about a concern about the relationship between wealth and power. Wealth translates into power. Larry Summers and I have both served in the government. Both of us know what that means. It's not only campaign contributions and lobbying. It's also huge amounts of money into public relations campaigns, into hiring squadrons, platoons of lawyers who can appeal and contest regulatory proceedings under the radar. It's all sorts of ways in which big money, even paying off professors to testify for the things that the wealthy want. All of these ways in which you get a kind of vicious cycle of wealth creating political change that alters the market to reward wealth that generates more wealth and therefore more political change in the direction of wealth. That's what we've seen over the last 50 years. That's why so many people think that the game is rigged against them.
Let me take that to Allison Schrager then. What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, do we feel that way about how Bill Gates is spending his money, trying to cure COVID, trying to cure diseases in Africa? And besides, I mean, I'm not going to sort of deny that certainly wealthy use their money to gain power, but a lot of that is happening at the corporate level. And I think we're talking about individual wealth, not corporate wealth. And besides, if we want to address this problem, we should address it directly. As Larry's pointed out, there's ways we can address the, problems with campaigns, giving all this sort of political influence. We don't have to redistribute wealth to do it. Let's just solve the problem directly.
So let me take that to Yanis. Take on Allison's point that the kinds of problems that your team has been talking about so far could be addressed other ways than having to take money away from rich people.
It's not a debate about the wealth tax. I'm far more concerned about corporate wealth, the accumulation of gargantuan power in the hands of very few corporations that distort markets, usurp markets, push real investment down, leading to what Larry Summers has described quite aptly as secular stagnation. In order to get out of this, we're not going to get out of this through tweaking income tax. I'll grant you yet again that we are not going to get out of it through wealth taxes, but we need to have a shift in the distribution of ownership, of wealth, of shares, of control over corporations. We need something, that's why I mentioned Theodore Roosevelt. We need to break up monopolies. This is all about redistributing power and wealth. This is exactly what happened in 1901. It's also what happened under the New Deal, when FDR put the financial genie in the bottle, as I said. So let's have a discussion about whether wealth should be redistributed, and let's then have another discussion about particular ways of doing it.
I want to take that to you, Larry. Yanis did not use the word socialism yet, but he is talking about a major reorganization of the way things are done in the capitalist part of the world, as in terms of wealth distribution, as a way to address this issue in inequality. So can you respond to that?
So I'm not sure exactly what Yanis has in mind. He's written that we should end capitalism itself and that there shouldn't be any market where shares in companies could be traded. I think that's a strategy that will lead to massive declines in everybody's income, and that's hardly the way to benefit the middle class. I believe that we should pursue a set of policies that would reduce the influence of money in politics. As I look, it's mostly corporations that do damage. It's mostly large coalitions, the sugar producers, the trade association representing 7,000 banks in the United States, the million realtors that keep prices high. We got to do something about those kinds of exploitations with political money. But a wealth tax isn't going to do that. Bob knows, actually, because he's been around all of this as much as I have, that you can be an enormous player around a political party if you contribute $6 million. There's no wealth tax we're talking about. There's no proposal they're making that's going to go anywhere near making Jeff Bezos, or who's ever number 400 on the Forbes 400, unable to be a big player in money in politics. You're just not going to go at it in an effective way by trying to take their money away. You can go at it by trying to insulate the system from the effects of money with all kinds of rules about transparency and all kinds of rules about where the donations can go. And so the question is whether the center of your strategy is trying to tear down the people who have been most successful, or whether the strategy is to allow people to be successful, to protect the system from being subverted, and to pick everybody else up. Is the problem that some people have billions, or is the problem that most people don't have hundreds of thousands? If we start from the idea that we want to do what's most effective for the people with hundreds of thousands, we'll get to the right kinds of answers, but redistributing the wealth won't be the central theme.
If I can say something, I want to suggest as gently as I can that my very, very esteemed opponents are putting on the table a bunch of red herrings. We are, as Yanni keeps saying, we're not debating a wealth tax. In fact, probably the best way of generating revenue, not just in terms of protecting democracy, but also generating revenue for all the other things we need to do, would be higher levies on capital gains and eliminating the stepped-up basis used to calculate capital gains at death, broadening the estate tax base, closing loopholes and shelters disproportionately used by the wealthy, such as carried interest. And I could go through a long list. But the point is that all of these require that you accept the notion that now is the time to redistribute wealth. That is what all of these notions are about. In fact, Larry Summers, I want to congratulate you, because everything I just listed, you put into a paper published recently about what policies are appropriate. And I want to agree with you publicly. These are all good ideas. But tell me that these are not about redistributing wealth. Of course they are about redistributing wealth. That's what they do. They redistribute wealth. They don't vilify the wealthy. This is not about tearing anybody down. This is about generating revenue and also indirectly, and we can talk more about it, about protecting the democratic process.
The only way you can do massive wealth redistribution is through a wealth tax, or I guess as Yanis suggests, some sort of collectivization that's sort of either Stalinist or Maoist.
When did I exactly suggest that, Allison?
Allison Schrager, your opponent, Robert, in his opening said, again, we need the money is there, that all of society could be lifted through investment in infrastructure, basic R&D, et cetera. That's where the money is. My question to you is, can that money be found in the pockets of the wealthy and brought constructively into the broader society and used that way without consequences, without negative consequences?
Well, it depends how you do it. I mean, I definitely agree with Reich here that, the best way to reform taxes is to remove distortions, broaden the base. No one likes stepped up in basis, which is just a way of sort of avoiding estate taxes, which I've never heard a good argument for. But the thing is, if we're talking about redistributing wealth, this is not going to be a large wealth distribution. The estate tax is 40% and only really applies to very rich people. And I mean, we could bring it down, but it's still a lot of people find ways around it. The only way you can do massive wealth redistribution is through a wealth tax, or I guess as Yanis suggests, some sort of collectivization that's sort of either Stalinist or Maoist. I'm not quite sure what he's arguing.
When did I exactly suggest that, Allison? I'm sorry, when did I exactly suggest that? Please do not do this. Play the ball, not the man.
I'm sorry.
And especially not with kicks that are completely out of order.
This is the very meaning of a red herring, quite literally.
Yeah.
Well, but how else are you going to take a lot of wealth from rich people and give it to poor people if it's not through taxation?
Well, you did hear me in my 4-minute introduction refer to the two Roosevelts. Both Theodore and Franklin effected massive wealth redistribution through breaking down corporate power, putting the financial genie in the bottle, and embarking upon a process of pressing into public service idle cash of rich people. So you may want to dismiss your own tradition of your own country, the Roosevelts,
I would disagree
by
with
calling
that.
me a Stalinist, but I think that this is, this simply lessens the quality of the conversation.
No, I would argue
Allison,
more that the New Deal...
Do you want to withdraw the Stalinist, Maoist comment so that we can move forward?
I would like you, Allison, to do this.
I do. It was unfair.
Please do.
It was unfair, but I do think you're mischaracterizing.
It was grossly offensive, Allison. It was not just unfair.
I'm sorry.
It was grossly insulting.
Yanis,
Okay,
I wouldn't
but
have
she's
said
withdrawn
what.
it. I admire you for withdrawing it.
I would not have said what Allison said. But when you write in 2020, my dream is to end capitalism. You need to be prepared to, that's what you wrote in 2020. You need to be prepared to accept that people are going to read it in that kind of way.
I'm happy to answer that.
But Larry, that's wait a minute. Can we just stop for
Hang on a second. Larry
and Allison. Wait. This has nothing to do. This has nothing to do with what Yanni may or may not have written years ago. This debate is whether now is the time to redistribute the wealth.
All right,
Larry, can I address your question?
My position is very...
It's a personal question and I need to address it.
I'm calling a timeout. As moderator, I'm calling a timeout on this. As moderator, I'm calling a timeout on this. That's why at Intelligence Squared we sort of discourage labels and ad hominem argumentation, because we then go down a rabbit hole of an individual feeling offended and we go around many circles.
And you do very well.
I appreciate, Allison, that you withdrew it. So thank you.
If you start from the idea that you're going to wage some kind of war on the billionaires, even if you win, you're not going to take the money out of the system.
Welcome back to That's Debatable, presented by Bloomberg and Intelligence Squared. The motion, is it time to redistribute the wealth? In 2019, there were an estimated 2,825 individual billionaires in the world. Of those, 788 were in the United States. What does the modern global billionaire class mean for the economy and for politics today? Here's more from two of our panelists, Robert Reich and Larry Summers, who both served in the Clinton administration, but who take seriously, starkly different positions on America's economic future.
Would Jeff Bezos be as motivated as he was to create Amazon if at the end of the rainbow was $2 billion instead of $200 billion? In other words, do we need the kinds and magnitude of riches that are extraordinary, that are new, that we haven't seen in this country before, in order to actually get Steve Jobs or Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or anybody else to do what they are doing? Now, when you talk about deserving, when you talk about the word deserving, that assumes that the market itself is neutral. But the market is not neutral. The market has been created by human beings, by legislators and agencies and courts. And the wealthy, because of the influence they have, and I'll include big corporations, have changed the organization of the market over time. Yanis talks about antitrust law. Well, if antitrust law were enforced as it was enforced 40 years ago, the chances are the big high-tech companies would not be nearly as large as they are right now. They would still be doing a lot of maybe good things, maybe not so good things, but antitrust has become a dead letter pretty much, largely because of the lobbying and political power and also the public relations exercises that a lot of the wealthy, including big corporations, have undertaken. We could talk about bankruptcy laws. We could talk about securities laws. Why were the banks bailed out and almost nobody sent to prison? And why is Dodd-Frank, that piece of legislation that's supposed to prevent us from going down that rabbit hole of financial calamity, why has that been watered down by the big banks? Because of political power, because they have so much wealth in the system. Larry, you know that. You and I have been there on the front lines.
Robert, I'm jumping in. I'm jumping in because I want to move on to something else, but I want to let Larry respond briefly to that point, and then I want to move on.
Here's the problem, Bob. Most of the reforms, increased antitrust and so forth that you talk about, they are good ideas. They should happen. The problem is that you take somebody who's got $10 billion and you make them have $3 billion, they've got plenty of money to do the kind of lobbying that they do. So there are approaches that would stop us from having those policies, but they're not launching some kind of attack that starts from the objective of redistributing the wealth. So the approach I favor anyway, is an approach that starts from the objective of having a better, fairer society. And that'll lead you to want to have better antitrust law. That'll lead you to want to have stronger financial regulation. But if you start from the idea that you're going to wage some kind of war on the billionaires, even if you win, you're not going to take the money out of the system because it's going to come from corporate treasuries, which will still exist even when you've taken a lot of money from the billionaires. So the question is, what's your central theme for responding to the problems of society? And pointing to billionaires and saying we should take their money away may feel good, but it's an ineffective political strategy that doesn't respond to the problem. And when you do take their money away and they dodge it by giving it away to a set of foundations and charities that will lobby for all the causes you loathe, you will have the problems you're worried about to a greater extent. So I share your commitment to a fairer society. The question is whether a political strategy like that Bernie Sanders used this spring of focusing on tearing down the wealth is the right way to get to what you and I both want to get to in the United States.
All right, Larry.
You are begging the question. You are begging the question. You're using metaphors that actually don't have any bearing upon what is actually being discussed. The real issue here, and let's agree and let's stipulate, the goal is a fair society.
Time out, because we have to move along.
It destroys the market incentives and signals to have so much wealth concentrated in such few hands.
I want to move on to the next part of our debate, and what we're going to be doing now is actually bringing in our global audience. Over the past few weeks, thousands of people around the world alerted to this debate, submitted their point of view by making an argument on the topic. We will use now artificial intelligence to help us understand what matters most to this global audience, what arguments and ideas that they thought were most important. And we did that by turning to IBM Watson, which uses AI to scale public opinion. Let's take a look at how that works. First, people around the world submit their arguments online. Then, the AI assesses the quality of the arguments, filtering out any irrelevant submissions, and sorting the remaining arguments into for and against. Next, the technology identifies the recurring key points, ranking them based on their quality and their frequency. Finally, the AI creates a coherent narrative of the strongest and most prevalent points for both sides of the debate. Okay, and now we get to hear it, a selection of the key points and arguments that our global audience, thousands of people around the world, thought were most important on this topic. So let's go to that.
Hello. Ahead of this debate, more than 3,500 arguments were submitted on the motion it's time to redistribute the wealth. The following analysis used AI models to identify the critical key points made by each side. 56% were for redistributing wealth, with 20% of submissions arguing that there is currently too much wealth inequality in the world. One argument was that income inequality has increased dramatically over the past few decades, causing excessive suffering to large populations, and that if wealth is not redistributed, far greater will suffer. Another key point for the motion was that redistribution of wealth will allow those with less opportunity to achieve success. People also think huge wealth gaps lead to social unrest and decreased security for all. The remaining 44% were against the motion, with 15% of submissions arguing that redistributing wealth would discourage some people from working hard. One argument in support of this is that redistributing the wealth discourages individual initiative, entrepreneurship, and accountability for choices. Please visit the website to see the full results. Good luck to the human debaters.
All right, and as we continue with the human debaters, it was interesting to hear the global audience hitting on some of the same dividing lines, but there was one I want to zero in on that was brought up in that analysis that we haven't heard, whether there would be a behavioral impact on those whose wealth would increase as a result of a redistribution, that it would discourage the desire to work. Let's take that to you, Yanis, that there would be a moral hazard to a redistribution of the wealth. What's your take on that?
If anyone, a singer, a film director, whatever, produces a service, a performance, and the public out there are prepared to give millions in order to experience that, I'm quite happy for them to have it, as long as they pay their income tax and they are, legally okay. But what happens once he has accumulated this money in a financial system that breeds a lot more money at the expense of stagnation for the many out there who are not simply, as I said, left behind, but they are held behind by very low investment in good quality jobs, in high technology and so on. So this is why we need seriously to tackle concentration of power, corporate power, and of wealth. This is why we need to redistribute wealth in a big bang way like it happened under the two Roosevelts, because it stifles innovation. It destroys the market incentives and signals to have so much wealth concentrated in such few hands.
And Allison, I want to thank you for the answer, Yanis. It took it a little bit away from the question that I asked, although you started at it. But I do want to hear from the other side on this question of whether there's a moral hazard to people who have less now getting more in a redistribution, or would that actually be a beneficial thing?
Well, I've never really completely bought the argument that Jeff Bezos would have only worked as hard if he only made, 500 million versus, several billion. But I do think there are definitely consequences. Again, I'm still not clear on how we're redistributing wealth. I guess the one thing we're all agreeing on is on higher capital income taxes. And what that certainly does do is I'm not sure it will reduce the incentive to work hard, but it will certainly reduce the sort of the gains from investing. And so whenever you make an investment, it's not that the money just sits there idly. It's not like the money of the rich is just idle. It's actually invested. And usually they put their money in something called a risky asset. And when you have a high capital income tax, that lowers the returns from risky investment, which might mean, maybe they'll still start to try to find a sort of good company, but where will the capital for that company come from? Because often it's rich people who invest in sort of new startups and are willing to take on that risk, and the returns from that investment will be smaller. And so it maybe won't reduce the incentives to work hard, but it will reduce the incentives to invest, and that's just as important.
Let's be clear about where we agree and where we disagree. I don't think there's anybody here, possibly Allison is in the category, but certainly I am in agreement with Bob and Yanis that a more progressive tax system would be desirable. That's not the question. The question is whether the center of the strategy should be around taking from the wealthy, which runs the risk that things will be pushed to a point where you will do substantial damage to the economy in terms of incentives. Bob's absolutely right. I've written in favor of higher capital gains taxes in terms of stepped up basis, in terms of closing estate tax loopholes. There are things we can do that will raise money from people who are wealthy in order to make necessary public investments in our country. And those investments should be disproportionately paid for by people who are wealthy. And yes, we should do things that reduce the influence of money in our politics and in our policy process. That is not the debate. The debate is whether the basis of the economic strategy should be some concept not of raising money for necessary public functions from those who are most fortunate, but whether the center of our economic strategy should be taking from the people who are most successful in order to have substantial distributions to the rest of us. And I think a society, an economic strategy based on growing the economy is better than a strategy based on taking and redistributing.
Okay, let me just, if I can. Larry is trying to restate and reinterpret and reframe what we're debating. Let me go back to what we were actually talking about. If we adopt many of the policies that Larry and I believe Yanni also have supported, everything from stricter antitrust enforcement to a more progressive income tax to better regulation of financial institutions, and I could go on, and the list is quite long. The consequence of all of these would be to redistribute wealth from the people at the top to the middle class and below. Now, why do you call that a strategy that is a strategy of envy, or a strategy that is based somehow on the goal of redistributing wealth? No, the consequence would be to redistribute wealth because we are trying to do other things. We're trying to both provide revenue for a variety of purposes that are publicly needed, and we're also trying to, at the margin, reduce that kind of political impact that great aggregations of wealth in corporations and by individuals have created. Now, that's what we are actually debating. We're not debating whether redistribution itself should be or necessarily is the goal. We're talking about the consequence of policies that we all agree on.
Let's raise taxes in the right way. Yes, let's have the right regulation, but let's not make tearing down the wealthy the theme and organization of our economic policy.
let's move on to round three, the resolution one more time. It's time to redistribute the wealth. Here making his closing statement in support of the motion, Robert Reich.
In 2015, a year before the last election, I was out in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Missouri, a lot of Rust Belt states, southern states, doing research for a book. I was doing free-floating focus groups. And I kept on asking people, middle class, working class people, many of them hourly wage workers, who do you support in the upcoming presidential race? And most of them came back to me and said something quite surprising. In the same sentence, they said, we like Bernie Sanders and we also like Donald Trump. Now, I was amazed when I first heard that because I had never heard those two men, the names, in the same sentence. How could that possibly be? But what I discovered after listening to their stories, these middle-class, working-class people in the Rust Belt and in the South, what I heard from them is, we want somebody who's going to shake things up. We want somebody who's anti-establishment. We want somebody who's going to be on our side. In other words, what we have created in this country, because of the enormous power of great wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, because of the enormous power of big corporations, concentrated power in terms of their political ability to get what they need, people in this country believe the game is rigged, and they are willing, again and again, whether they are on the left or the right, Democrats or Republicans, to support somebody who they believe is going to topple the power structure. That is a recipe for instability.
So I also have a story. Last March, Kylie Jenner, the reality show and makeup mogul, at just 21 was declared a billionaire when she sold 51% of her cosmetics company for $600 million. Although about a year later, as people looked a little bit more closely, or the company was run by a public company that was a little bit more rigorous, it was revealed that, well, Ms. Jenner is indeed a very wealthy woman. She is not a billionaire. And I think this story reveals a couple things. One, we really don't know how wealthy a lot of people are. If you have an incentive to make your wealth look larger, you can. If you have an incentive to make it look smaller, like you have a tax liability, you also can do that. And Kylie Jenner also shows, we might have mixed feelings about the wealthiest people. The Kardashians are a divisive bunch of people. But you can't deny that the wealthiest people in America, a lot of them made their money in not a zero-sum way. They created value. They created jobs. They created products that we use every day. And economist William Nordhaus estimates that innovators only capture 2% of the economic value they create. So is there scope for more equality, for improving the safety net, for expanding the equality of opportunity? I mean, absolutely. I think these are the hallmarks of a civilized society. But there are always trade-offs in cost to redistributing resources. And wealth redistribution tends to pose the most costs and offer the fewest benefits.
If life under capitalism resembled the 100-meter sprint in the Olympic Games, of course it would be absurd to ask the fastest athletes, to slow down or to, stop them from going fast in support or in solidarity with the laggards. That would have been absolutely ridiculous, and nobody would want to watch this race. But life is no Olympic Games. It resembles more these days the Roman arena, in which very well-armed gladiators are facing victims that are weaponless, victims who are defeated not because they did not try hard enough or because they were not clever enough, but because they were unarmed, because of the asymmetry in the initial distribution of armor, of wealth. You see, for a while now, I think we know that, don't we? Hard work can no longer be relied upon to lift people from poverty. This is the tragedy of the last 30 years. But let's finish off positively. And let me convey to Larry my kind of socialism, the kind of ideal that fires me up. It will be a sporting parallel. But it's not going to be the Olympics, it's going to be the National Football League, your NFL, where in the interests of competition, not fairness, teams face a harsh salary cap, and the best players, the best young players, are forced to sign up for the weakest of teams. So by preventing the successful team from monopolizing the best players, the NFL's constraints liberate the true spirit of competition. This is the point about, socialism, which is NFL, living together with markets, in sin with harsh competition, which is what the NFL is, I think, a good model for the future.
I think Yanis showed what this debate is about very powerfully in what he just said. By signing up for the resolution that put central focus on the redistribution aspect, he showed where he was. He thought the NFL, where their salary caps put on people, where the best players aren't allowed to go work for the best teams, where it's all centrally controlled, he held that out as a model for how our society should be organized. And that's the kind of direction you head when you make redistributing wealth the central theme of your policies, rather than creating a better society for the middle class, the central theme of your societies. And that's not where I think we should go, and I think it's pretty dangerous. And here's a way of thinking about it. I ask myself the question, would it have been better if there were more people like Andrew Carnegie? If there were more people, for all his flaws, like John D. Rockefeller? Would we be a better, more flourishing society with more of that or with less of that? Would we be better if we had 5 more people who started in America like Steve Jobs? I think we'd have been better. So yes, let's raise taxes in the right way. Yes, let's have the right regulation. But let's not make tearing down the wealthy the theme and organization of our economic policy.
All right, that concludes the final round of the debate. Let's look how it went. Our audience cast a vote before and after the arguments, and it is the difference between the first and the second vote that determines our winner. Here are the results. On the first vote, on the resolution, it's time to redistribute the wealth, 57% of our audience watching agreed. 20% were against it, 23% were undecided. That's the first result. We're looking for the difference. So in the team arguing for the resolution, it's time to redistribute the wealth, their first vote was 57%. Their second vote was 59%. They pulled up 2 percentage points, which is now the number to beat. Let's look at the other side. The team arguing against the resolution, their first vote was 20%. Their second vote was 37%. They pulled up 17 percentage points. That means that they are the winning team, the team arguing against the resolution. It's time to redistribute the wealth, declared our winner. Congratulations to them. But really, congratulations to everybody for taking part in the debate, for shedding light, for teaching us, and for making it all interesting. Stay tuned for Bloomberg's next debate in partnership with Intelligence Squared on November 6th at 7 p.m. The U.S.-China space race, is it good for humanity? I'm John Donvan. More Bloomberg Television starting now.